Gunfire amid claims of victory as Ukraine's counter-offensive gets underway.
We, the representatives of the 137th Battalion of the Marine Infantry and the 35th Brigade of the Marine Infantry, have liberated the village of Makarivka in the Donetsk region from Russian troops. They won't be able to retake this village. They are firing, as you can hear, with artillery, mortars and tanks. But we will hold on. Glory to Ukraine.
Kyiv says its counter-offensive has recaptured villages in the Donetsk and Zaporizhia regions. But the Russian Defense Ministry released these pictures, claiming that they had repelled counter-offensive attacks by Ukrainian forces. President Putin described opposition losses as close to catastrophic. Here in Shazif Yar, the battle for control rumbles on. The city was once home to 12,000 people. For the few who remain, information is scarce.
We don't have electricity or internet. You came here and told us that the counteroffensive had already begun. The fact that we are here walking around and wondering if it started doesn't really seem right.
Ukraine says it has liberated as many as 7 villages on its front lines.
3 days ago, the Russian forces were still here. We chased them out from Neskuchnya. Glory to Ukraine. This village was under Russian occupation for 1.5 years, but these are Ukrainian lands.
There may be optimism over purported gains, but beneath the blue and yellow of Ukraine's flag lie the bodies of those killed in the fight.
Well, for more analysis, we are now joined by Justin Crump, a military veteran, intelligence and security expert, CEO of Sibylline, which is a strategic advisory company. He joins us from the UK. Great to have you with us, Justin. It's only early days in the Ukrainian counter-offensive. What's your understanding of the Ukrainian advance as it stands?
I mean, as you just heard, Ukraine is advancing on a few axes. There are 2 main ones in the south, in the Oblast of Zaporizhia, and then on the boundary between that and the Donetsk region. And that's the area where your correspondent was just reporting that Ukraine has captured a string of villages along a river valley there that sort of starts to push towards where Russia's occupied land in Ukraine and built those long defensive lines you've seen. But they're also pushing in the east, and you and I have talked before about Bakhmut, obviously a big focus of Russian offensive activity for a long period of time until they eventually sort of occupied the entire city. But Ukraine currently pushing back around there as well, slowly and steadily, but in that area, just gaining small amounts of ground each day, but starting to put more pressure on the Russians there as well. So they're developing a few options right now.
Justin, the Ukrainians have surprised everyone before. Is there anything unexpected? Is there anything that has surprised you about the tactics they're choosing?
I'll say not so far in terms of what they're doing, but I think it's very important to say these are the opening stages of a long drawn-out offensive by Ukraine. This was never going to be 3 days to the coast, to the Sea of Azov, which is probably one of their intended lines of attack to try and cut the Russians in half in southern Ukraine to threaten Crimea. That's probably one of the key objectives they have. This phase is all about slowly gathering ground, gathering information on the Russians, seizing advantageous positions, drawing out Russian reserves, fighting Russian artillery, electronic warfare assets, their commanders, their logistics. It's about targeting all of those things and building the conditions for the next phase of the attack. And I think that's where Ukraine has real surprises to come as it develops this complex picture over a period of time. So I think some people have been surprised we haven't seen more advances from Ukraine, but it makes sense with the task they're up against, this very comprehensive defensive line in the south, that they're going to take their time, they're going to go steady, and they're going to try and build opportunities from a sound foundation.
The head of the Wagner mercenary group, Yevgeny Prigozhin, says it will take a month and a half before we can say what the counter-offensive has achieved. Is that a time frame you would concur with before we pass judgment?
I mean, I hate to agree with him on anything at all, to be honest, but yeah, I think that's entirely my thinking as well, my team's thinking. I mean, Ukraine has several months in hand, effectively, to try and regain territory before the winter sets in again, the mud season sets in again. And I think he's right that you can't judge a success or failure of this offensive in the first day or two, and even in the first week or two. I think it does take some time before we see Ukraine make more daring advances, potentially once they've wound down that initial level of Russian defences. So I think that is a good time frame. This is something we're going to be coming back to, I'm sure, quite often to have a look at and sort of see how it's progressing. So nothing at all decided so far, and nothing we're seeing on the battlefield is giving a huge indication of which way it's going. But it was going to be a brutal fight all along. Ukraine knows that. They're in it for the long term. And obviously they're going to keep pushing away at these Russian first lines of defences and screening areas for as long as they can to build that picture I talked about.
The hardware that Ukraine received promised to be a game changer on the battlefield. In terms of defence, the Patriot systems seem to have performed admirably. In terms of attack, though, do we know how effective the howitzers, the tanks, the armoured vehicles are proving going forward for Ukraine?
Yeah, the game changer thing, and we've heard it time and time again in this conflict, and there's pretty much never been a game-changing weapon system in its own right, other than potentially nuclear weapons. I think anything short of that can offer you some tactical advantages, but nothing on the battlefield is omnipresent. Nothing on the battlefield is invulnerable. There is no silver bullet in modern warfare. It's about how you use those things together. And so I think the fact that we've seen some lost Leopard tanks, for example, and American Bradley on the personnel carriers, it got some people very concerned that they saw that very early on. But the reality is, and I hate to say it as a tank commander, but tanks are expendable. They're just expected to do quite a bit before they eventually get killed, because battles are hard. War is brutal. The advantage, I think, though, of the sort of equipment that Ukraine's been receiving, and we've seen lots of evidence of this, is that it is much more survivable than the Russian equipment. The Soviet Union didn't particularly value the lives of its people because it had lots of them. So they had a doctrine about having lots of cheap equipment that was very fast, not very well protected, but they could use that on the battlefield in large numbers. The Russian equipment now, of course, has come from that ancestry. By contrast, NATO did not have a lot of soldiers. It valued the people very highly. And so we built equipment that's much more survivable. It has thicker armor. It has protection for if ammunition explodes. And what we've seen on the battlefield is that the Western supplied equipment, when it is destroyed, most commonly by mines, the crews are escaping, the infantry in the back are escaping, and they're able to fight again. And I think that's one of the more interesting points of the coverage we have seen so far of those vehicles in use, and again, suffering losses. But that is to be expected. They have plenty more, and huge amounts that have not yet been committed to the fight.
Just particularly in terms of the Leopard, this piece of equipment well. Is there any surprise that Ukraine is losing these weapons in battle?
No, again, I think expectations were raised, and of course there's a lot of information aspects of this particular conflict, particularly on social media. Obviously the big campaign about the Leopards are coming, and the reality is, if anyone could pick one of the most average Russian tanks and one of the average tanks that Ukraine has, you would pick the Leopard as being a much more survivable vehicle, much better to command, much more capable. But again, it's not invulnerable. It is not a box that can't be destroyed. It's very easy in these sorts of operations to have a bad day out, unfortunately, and lose a lot of people, especially when you're trying to get through a minefield, and lose a lot of vehicles. And again, it's really important in this that the people manage to escape, the crews get back. They can always be put on a new vehicle. We've learned that in previous conflicts, but you can't replace that trained crew. Ukraine especially has a smaller pool of available soldiers. So they have to look after those crews more. It's also hugely important for morale and for keeping a force going through an offensive. So compared to Russia, it has given Ukraine a lot of advantages. And it's also fighting very well at night at the moment, a lot of this equipment, because it has thermal sights, it can heat-based sights, and we're seeing much more use of nighttime tactics and indeed the use of smoke on the battlefield to protect these more modern vehicles. And that's something we didn't see before, along with an evolution of tactics. So, overall, it's definitely progressing in how Ukraine is waging war. They are on the offensive now, and it's not going to be a week or so, it's going to be a few months.
Briefly before we go, President Putin today claimed to have knocked out 30% of Ukraine's armour, that Ukraine is suffering 10 times the casualties Russian forces are taking. What do you make of those claims?
they're pretty ludicrous. I mean, both sides obviously in war almost always make inflated claims about what they've done to the enemy, so you always take these numbers with a pinch of salt. But the current Russian claims are pretty ludicrous, and they don't have the coverage to back it up. They're showing the same clips again and again of vehicles. So I think that's very inflated and aimed at his own audience. But it is brutal fighting, and we should all bear that in mind. This is a hard operation for both sides, and a lot of lives are going to be lost in the fight.
Justin Crump, great to get your input at this critical moment in the war. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
John Spencer is the chair of Urban Warfare Studies with the Madison Policy Forum and the author of Understanding Urban Warfare. He joins us from Colorado Springs. John, the Ukrainian military were understandably tight-lipped on tactics, but they are claiming now gains on the battlefield. Can we verify that, and do we know exactly how significant those gains are?
Yeah, I think we can verify those. There's plenty of geolocating, open source intelligence sources that have validated the videos of Ukrainian flags going over recently liberated villages are in fact true. So it's pretty undeniable, and that's probably frustrating to Russia, who likes to control information. How significant is it in the counteroffensive? It's significant to break through the lines of Russian defenses, but it's, to be frank, we're only seeing probably about 10% of what's actually been allocated for the counteroffensive. So there's a lot of fighting and a lot of new territory to be liberated to come.
John, it seems that the counteroffensive is happening on many, many fronts. Strategically speaking, what's the thinking behind that? What are the advantages?
Sure. So the advantage is to keep the Russians guessing. I mean, secrecy is still the number one thing in war and campaigning like this. So Ukrainians need to attack on multiple axes, but truly hide where the main attack is and what their ultimate goal is, which I don't know, and nobody should know. But yes, we see fighting in Bakhmut, in the Donetsk, in the southern Ukraine. That's great. But we do see, like I said, only about 10% in like the Marine infantry we just played are still having considerable gains. And that increases the range of Western or Ukrainian systems like the MLRS on what they can reach in support of the bigger attacks.
So we know about some of that Ukrainian equipment they have on their side now, but having had 6 months to dig in on Ukrainian territory, waiting for this counteroffensive, how strong is that Russian position?
Yeah, it's hard to say where it is strong. Of course, they spend a lot of time trying to defend, but they don't have the military, the numbers to defend that large of even a defensive line if it's well constructed, because we've seen everything from shallow trenches that in the recent videos to more prepared defensives. But I don't think that they have the military or the flexibility you would need to hold that defensive line. So maybe it's strong in some locations, and why we see, again, another reason for Ukrainians attacking at multiple points is to identify the strength and weaknesses in the Russian line.
John, it's only early days, but how important do you think these next few weeks will be in determining the outcome of the war?
I mean, I think it's a vital phase. It won't end the war, of course, and all wars end at a table where hopefully Putin agrees to remove the Russian military out of Ukraine ultimately. But this phase, this counteroffensive, is vital to positioning the Ukrainians at a great position of advantage over Russian forces in the south and in the east. Cut the land bridge, cut the strategic resupply routes and routes that the Russians have been familiar with all the way since 2014. I mean, Putin's gone from a path to being a great power again to now the greatest terrorist in the world, bombing civilians every day.
Great to get your insight, John Spencer. Thanks so much. Well, NATO Secretary-General Jens Stoltenberg says Ukrainians are making progress in their counter-offensive against Russian forces. He also expects NATO leaders will increase military assistance to Kyiv when they meet next month in Lithuania. Stoltenberg made the comments as he met with US President Joe Biden at the White House. His visit came amid speculation over whether his term as NATO chief will be extended past September. Joining me now is DW Washington correspondent Michaela Kufner. Welcome to you, Michaela. What was the focus of these meetings today?
Well, it's billed as a courtesy visit. Basically, Jens Stoltenberg, the NATO Secretary-General, is making the rounds through the capitals of the 31 NATO members ahead of that key summit. It's always a key summit with NATO coming up in Lithuania next month. But of course, the United States is a very important partner indeed, not just when it comes to the question who should succeed the current NATO Secretary General Stoltenberg when his job comes up in September, or indeed he should stay another term after extending already for 3 times, which is highly unusual also in the NATO universe, and a strong signal again of unity and of more resources being sent towards Ukraine. It's no coincidence that today the United States published that once again it will send more than $300 million worth of equipment towards Ukraine.
Beyond who is leading NATO, what about Ukraine and its prospects of joining NATO? Was there any discussion or any movement there?
Well, this was pretty much behind-the-scenes debate. There was no official press conference. We only caught a couple of comments. What we're seeing is the U.S. president not wanting to make any comment in that direction. We've seen reporting from behind the scenes basically indicating that this could potentially be seen as a provocation of Russia. So the United States is refraining from that for now. Legally, NATO cannot take on a new member who is currently experiencing a hot conflict, and Ukraine certainly is. Even if there was negotiations, that wouldn't suffice. So it's always been a rhetoric pointing towards the necessity of there being unity amongst NATO members when it comes to taking on a new member. And we're seeing that's already sparking a lot of controversy when it comes to Sweden. There we see Turkey potentially at least delaying this, with the US president having just weighed in and saying that he promises that that will happen next month. So this is clearly a mighty word that Joe Biden issued there ahead of that NATO summit coming up next month.
DW's Michaela Kufner in Washington. Thank you.
And we stay in Ukraine, which is reporting incremental gains by its counteroffensive. And I asked Marina Miron, an honorary research fellow at King's College London, how substantial these gains are.
Well, given the fact that the counteroffensive has begun about a week ago, it's too early to say. So far, we have seen some mixed results. The Russian side has claimed that they managed to push back the Ukrainian troops. The Ukrainian troops claim that they have taken a few settlements, and I think the most successes have been seen in the Donetsk region and in some settlements in Zaporizhia. However, it is too early to judge. We shouldn't be overestimating the setbacks, and we shouldn't be overestimating the gains made so far.
Now, these reports are coming from different areas of Ukraine, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, Bakhmut, without a single area of focus. Can you tell us more what might be the strategy behind it?
Well, the idea here is to keep the Russians guessing, because the Russians have been preparing for this counteroffensive for quite a while now. And so the Ukrainians have to maintain the initiative of surprise, which is very difficult when the counteroffensive has been announced in the media for so many months now, and possible directions have been discussed. So the idea is to see where the Russian defenses are at their weakest and to strike at different points in order to disorient the Russians so that they don't know where the main strike will be taking place. And this is why we're seeing activities across the Russian border in Belgorod region. We're seeing also some movements around Bakhmut, where the Ukrainian forces claim to have pushed back the Russian forces on the flanks of Bakhmut. We're seeing the South Dnipro region attacks, and we're also seeing, obviously, Zaporizhia, which might be the main focus of the Ukrainian armed forces. So this is a strategy of thousand cuts.
Now, the Russians have had months to dig in for the Ukrainian offensive, and apparently also successful, at least in parts. We hear about destroyed tanks, like the German Leopard tanks. How strong is their defense?
Well, some Western officials have described it as one of the most complex defense systems seen so far, and Russians have apparently good engineering skills when it comes to building defenses. So those echelon defenses they have built are quite complex, and they've had time since November 2022 when they started preparing those defenses, and they consist of different layers. So they have minefields, and they have foxholes, they have trenches, they also have the so-called dragon teeth to prevent the tanks from getting through if they pass all the other layers, and then they also have artillery in the back, and obviously air surveillance in order to see where the Ukrainians are coming from, making it very difficult for the Ukrainians to get through all the layers of these defenses without getting stuck, which makes it very challenging for the Ukrainian side, especially because they lack air power capabilities.